Okay, there we go. Microphone working now. Morning, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about grad school and research. Today's lecture is going to be a bit shorter than normal. I don't expect more than about maybe 30 minutes. The assignment is up on Moodle. I sent out an email about it last week, and it's due next week. And it's pretty short. You can write as little or as much as you want, and I guess it could take you anywhere from like 10 to 30 minutes, depending on how much time you want to put in. So I do want to do a precursor for today, though. Note that tomorrow is election day. Most of you are going to be 18, and it is your right to vote. So go vote. I know that in the CS department, emails have been sent out trying to get people to cancel lectures on election day. I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but apparently a good amount of professors are trying to work to have less workload for students around this time. So again, I'm not sure how that's going to be reflected in the lower level CS classes, but that's what I've been told at least. So go ahead and get this shared. Okay. So one thing that I want to answer first about grad school and research is sort of clarifying what research really is, because I know that I've thrown around the term, and it's not entirely clear to some people what it entails. So really there's, at least regarded in the CS world, there's two main uses for your time and expertise, and that's typically regarded as being split into either research or industry. Now you can have industry research, that's a thing, but as per when I say industry, this is usually referring to engineering, right? So some people want to say there's like research positions and engineering positions. And the difference between these two, right, is essentially for research, right, you're working on novel problems, right? So there are novel problems that you want to try and figure out the answers to, and you think that you might have some answers that you think are correct in advance, and these are called hypotheses, really, and then you're testing them. And more or less, research centers around trying to find out answers to typically hard problems. Whereas on the other hand, while engineering is about solving problems, typically the solutions to these things are already known, right? It's more about implementation, right? So you may be solving problems, right? You may be solving problems, but the answers to these are more likely than not already known. And in the case of where the answers aren't strictly known, this is something where you would basically be doing your own type of research while trying to solve them, but you're not, trying to convince other people that they're correct. You're implementing them for whatever job or position you have, and you don't need to convince other people that, this can be used in their own systems, or, that you need to consult, past work, or really sort of develop any sort of, reproducible methodology or anything, which is a lot of what research entails, is reading other work in the space and seeing how your work fits into the space, and trying to clarify how your work can be reproduced and replicated, making sure that it's not just like a one-off time thing, stuff like that, right? Like consider, like the laws of thermodynamics, right? Those need to be proved, and it needs to be put into the space as per where those fit within thermodynamics. Whereas when you consider, maybe you're implementing some sort of solution to a problem at Google or something, right? Really, the only thing you need to do is just test if it works, right? And if it works in practice, maybe it's just in your environment and just in that solution that it works, then that's fine, right? It doesn't even have to be the most efficient. It just has to do the job well enough, right? And that's really what that is. Now, typically what this leads to is, because you have to solve novel problems, this is going to be more time consuming. Actually, let me this here. So this is going to be more time consuming, right? This is typically why people who do research have worse hours than people who do engineering work. Now, that's not strictly 100% the case. Some companies like Amazon are known for working employees very hard to where you will work more than 40 hours a week. But most bigger tech companies don't actually do that, and that you will be working 40 hours a week on average. What usually the way that tech companies do this is that you will be salaried, in which you will get your yearly wage, and you will just have deadlines to meet. And as long as you meet the deadlines, they don't really care how much work you're putting in. They don't really care whether it's like 30 hours or 60 hours. As long as you're meeting your deadlines, then they don't really care. And those deadlines are usually set out, depending on the company, to take, on average, they expect for those to take around 40 hours a week of work to build up to. On the other hand, with research, right? Now, if you're in industry, this might be different, but at least to start the research process, you have to, work on some sort of advanced degree. And while you're doing a master's or a PhD, same as you'd be doing, a bachelor's, but it would be a large time investment, right? And so the hours for research are known to be more difficult, and the pay is going to be less, right? Because you're not implementing solutions to problems that can immediately then go and be marketed, right? And that can immediately go and have some return on investment, right? With research, it takes time. It could take you 1 to 2 years of research to solve some problem, say in like data center networks. And then it could take a matter of days for someone who's working in industry to go find that solution and implement it, right? And they could do that. Most of the time, this research work is, public domain. So it really kind of depends on what side of the coin you want to be on as per what you're doing. You can definitely find places in which they take the same amount of work hours. You'll get similar pay. So examples are Microsoft Research is known for having very good pay and very being very open-ended and stuff, but also not requiring much as many like work hours as some other research places. And the other main difference that I'd say is your freedom for what you can work on, right? So when you're working on research, there's really two methods of funding, right? And so this is where you would get paid from. This is where you would, this is where anyone that you work with would get paid from. If you have like people working under you, this is where, you'll get funding for being able to purchase equipment that you need, or to rent servers, or whatever else you need to do your work, right? Licenses for software and stuff. And so the two main methods of research funding, you have grants, right? And then you have more like regular income for funding, which might be through stipends, right? It might be through, and stipends are really just same as like yearly salary. It's just another word for that used in research. It might be funded by corporate, right? Or some other workplace, right? But the difference between these two is that for a stipend or like some sort of corporate funding, you don't really have to make an argument for this. This is something where you're hired to do a particular task. And so in that case, you might have more freedom still, but you're going to have less freedom than if it's like grant funding. So grant funding is where there are research grants, which would be, pools of money essentially that you apply for, and you describe what your research problem is, why it's important, how you're going to go about solving it, that kind of stuff, right? And that's where the differences in engineering and research kind of like primarily comes out, is that research then ends up oftentimes giving you more open-ended space to work on what you feel is important, right? And that you want to work on, right? But the funding is often less secured because you're not working on something that oftentimes you're not working on something that is immediately applicable, right? Say that, you did go and work on some research problems that you approached in similar to an engineering way that would be immediately applicable. Well, those are the people who do, pretty well in research, that they're able to work on problems and they find problems interesting that are immediately applicable, right? And that can immediately see some return on investment. And those would be people working at, like, say, Facebook research, right? Or like typically those are people working in the research divisions of industry companies, right? And they don't have to fight for grants or anything like that, right? But they still have some more research freedom than, say, someone doing engineering work, where you will be assigned some task to do, and that's all you really are allowed to do. And doing extra work outside of that for something else, if you're taking, basically, if you're taking, your set amount of time where you're supposed to work like 40 hours a week, right? And you're using that to work on something else than other one you're assigned, then that's bad, right? That's going to be reflected on you in your performance reviews, right? Whereas if you're taking extra time outside of that 40 hours to work on other stuff you find interesting, then that's fine, right? But then you're not getting really paid for that, right? Or you're working more hours that you're not getting paid for. So keep that in mind when you're doing industry, when you're thinking about engineering versus research work. That's not to say that any other is like less satisfying than the other. Both are definitely, have their own satisfaction components to it. In my experience, I like the part that research is a lot more open and that I can decide what's interesting to me. And I can change my mind, right? And I can change directions on a project, or I can completely discard the project and start a new one, right? If I don't think it's good anymore. But on the other hand, with engineering, it's a lot more stable, right? If you're going to work in industry doing some engineering work, you get your yearly salary that's going to be very high, and you always have stuff to do that's assigned to you. You don't really have to critically think about what is interesting, right? And that what needs, work on it, because you're given that, right? So I think that both then have, their components. I think that typically people who do engineering work will have a better work-life balance because of that, right? Whereas people who do research are typically more fulfilled with their jobs, right, than people who do engineering work. And so it's kind of that trade-off. People who do research usually stay in whatever company that they're doing research in for a lot longer than people who do engineering work, right? You say like average turnaround for tech company employees. Okay, so I know the average turnaround is very high, right? Big tech giants overall average is 3.68 years. And the reason, actually, it used to be even smaller than that. And it really depends on companies. So we'll do like Amazon retention rate. So here's an example. So okay, median tenure of roughly 1 year, right, at Amazon. And this is July 3rd, right? So very recent. That's not great, right? Like, you want to have people wanting to stay for longer. And the difference is that when you're doing, this engineering, is that the time scale is much smaller, right? You can, solve a problem or, implement a solution to a problem in a relatively short amount of time, and you're expected to do so, compared to research, where it can take 1 to 2 years for just a single project, right? And so for that reason, right, you could do many projects within that amount of time, working in engineering at a given company. And actually, there are a lot of tricks and tactics that big tech companies use to try and retain employees, because they expect them to do all this doing a lot of work in a short time period, and so that can be stressful. And so they use a lot of techniques and tactics to try and get people to stay. And they have, you know, documents internally about how they can do this. Examples of very common things are work perks, where you know, have all these things that are provided to you, sort of supposedly like free of charge, right? Like you get really nice breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? Whenever you're working for a big tech company, they'll have like cafeterias in their buildings where you will have like 5-star chefs, right? Like they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on hiring really nice chefs to make, you know, lobster, steak, whatever you want, really. But what does that make you do? Well, that makes you stay at work during those work hours, right? Suddenly all these people who have their right to go take a lunch break out are going to be doing that in, you know, their own workplace, and that makes them more likely to have a shorter lunch break or a shorter, you know, whatever, and spend more time working, or even work through their lunch break just while eating, right? As you might do as a student, right? Likewise, if they're eating breakfast and dinner there, right, they're staying there when they probably shouldn't, right? Typically what you do is you eat lunch at work as a break, and then you have breakfast before you go to work and dinner when you get home, right? Well, in big tech, right, they try to turn it so that you do all of that at work. And then what that makes is that while you're on a salary, right, you'll still see people there working 50 to 60 hours a week because they just live at work, right? Other examples, right, of trying to do employee retention would be other, you know, what is it called? Stock benefits, right? So an example is typically the big tech companies will give you a lot of money in stock, right? So they'll say, all right, we're gonna give you, say, $200,000 worth of Amazon stock, right? But that's going to be vested over 4 years. And what that would mean is something like every 6 months, you'll receive a fourth of that value, right? So that means that you would stay there for a minimum of 2 years before you would get the full stock amount that you were promised, right? And so a lot of times what people do is they will basically go to one tech company out of their bachelor's, for example, go to one tech company, work there for 2 to 3 years, then leave and go to another one where they're offered higher pay, right? Because they're coming in with more engineering experience. It's easier for them to climb the ladder elsewhere. Maybe they've stalled out, and they would go work elsewhere for higher pay. And they would already have, you know, the stock benefits from the previous company, right? So they do a lot to try and retain employees, right? They give all kinds of other benefits, gym things and transportation credits. They give you free Ubers, free Lyfts, right? This is why they treat you really nice when they try to have you come interview for them. They'll, like, you know, pay your tickets for whatever, and then they'll give you, you know, $100 a day in meal, whatever, in meal reimbursement, so you can eat out wherever you want, you know. It's sort of like the whining and dining, right? That's done when they try to hire people, is because they're trying to have them come work for them for a longer period of time. There's not a huge amount of pool of people who are really, 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 you know, at the high end that these companies want. And so they'll want to retain the people who are good, right? That they've already vetted, made sure they're like good to hire, right? It's a large investment to hire someone. Okay, so those are just some of the examples. And that also, you know, is that when you do consider offers for places like this, really try to consider all the facets and see if you have, you know, friends or people who have worked there that you can ask about the work life there, because it really is important to consider. You're essentially committing to, you know, at least a year or two of time at a place where, you know, you want to make sure that you're not wanting to just break, you know, every day, right? Okay. Okay, so for some more, guess examples of this research versus engineering front, I think that a good example of where you can actually strike a balance is in, I'd say, in the systems and in machine learning areas. So an example would be where you're an engineer, say at Google, right? And you actually do have a problem that you need to solve, and you spend a fair amount of time doing work on it and implementing it and testing it. And then later on down the road, after it's been working for a while, then you write a paper about it. Good examples of this, right? is this here, which has over 2,000 citations, very popular paper from 2013, right? And you can see that typically when papers like this are published, they have like a bunch of engineers all working at that company, right? And most people who work as engineers at big tech companies have done some amount of research before, either during their undergrad or something. And so they will oftentimes find, that if they want to do research, then you can typically find, people there who want to do research with you. You just won't be able to do it, strictly during all of your work hours, right? Because you'll be working on other things. But this is an example, right, of B4, which is the platform that Google uses to do all of their traffic engineering, right? So this is where, whenever you send a request to watch a YouTube video, right? What server is that directed to, and how are those servers all connected together, right? And that's really what Google's B4 is about, because there are hundreds of thousands of servers and billions of people to serve, right? And you have a limited amount of resources. So it's about how do you make efficient use of those resources, right? The good thing about doing industry research as well, if you're like an engineer at an industry company or research, is that it's typically very easy to get published because you have access to data that no one else has, right? Like outside of this list of people and say other Google employees, no public researcher working at some university has access to all the data that they're using in this paper, right? No one has access to all of Google's server data or all of the requests that people make to Google, right? No one has that except for Google. And so typically you'll find that like, even if papers are poorly written, they'll get into, nice conferences and stuff. So if you want to like go into industry and then switch into research later, you definitely can. Like that happens a lot as well, as does the other way around. So the other component that I want to talk about now is grad school and how that fits into research. So with grad school, just to recap, though we've talked about this a bit already, is that you typically, so you have, at least in the US, you have two relevant types of degrees that we're talking about. This is like an MS and a PhD. There are many other types of degrees, right? You can get like MBAs or whatever, but for relevant stuff in computer science, that would be your MS and your PhD. MS typically is 2 years. This is after your bachelor's, right? And most of the time, people who do master's degrees go into industry and they're using it as a way to get more research work, or they're using it as a way to sort of, advance their specialization in a certain area, whether that be in machine learning or whether it be in networks or, some security stuff or whatever, right? And for that reason, there are also many programs that offer master's degrees that are, tailored towards those things. So as an example, in UMass, we have a master's degree where you can get a specialization on your degree for cybersecurity or for machine learning. And we have those two pathways, right? And it's just based on like courses that you take, they'll give you this like specialization, right? That says that like, that's what you primarily took courses in. Then they also have like a research track and an industry track here, which is where like in a research track, you'd be doing more research and you have more classes before towards research, whereas industry, you're doing more classes that are just applicable to you in industry. And then plenty of places will have, more specific master's degrees as well. That, example, Carnegie Mellon probably has like a master's degree from like machine learning, right? More specific than just computer science. And so you do find, the majority of people get it for doing industry work, but not everyone. Some people do it for research. And typically the people who do masters for research would then go into a PhD afterwards. And in CS, this is anywhere from 4 to 6 years on average. And a PhD is primarily composed of research, right? You really only take a couple of classes during your PhD. Your master's is where you take most of, the classes for building up the foundation that you would then, use in your PhD. So typically like first year joint MS/PhD students, first and second year students would be taking, classes, and then into the third year, they'd finish up their classes. And then the next 3 to 4 years would be spent purely on research, right? And so PhD is really where you learn how to do research, right? That's where you learn about, novel research methods, the research process, right? That kind of stuff. There's a question, does PhD require a master's? In the US, yeah, that's the case. Not everywhere, but in the US, you can either get a bachelor's, then a master's, then a PhD, or you can get a bachelor's and then you can do a joint master's PhD, which is where you are enrolled as a PhD student, but you get your master's first. And then after that's done, then you get your PhD, right? And it's just like slightly less time. And during that time, you're classified as a PhD student. You're going to be doing more research oriented stuff during, your master's degree portion. So that's really like, if you're interested in doing research and you want to do, PhD, then you would typically in the US, we would go for a MS PhD right out of your bachelor's, or you would do your bachelor's, go to industry for a while, then do your MS PhD, or you do bachelor's, then your master's, then go to industry for a while, then come back for PhD, right? So you can do it like any one of those ways. But typically in the US, yeah. Now this does vary depending on what country you go to. As an example, some master's degrees in some Western European countries are 1 year, some bachelor's are 3 years, some PhDs are 2 years, right? So really it's a different amount of time for each. And, just consider if you're thinking about doing like, whatever degree abroad, then consider, how that country's education, graduate education is done. But this is the case in the US. And before, let's see. So next, I'll talk about how you would go about getting into these programs. So for doing a graduate program, typically what you would have to do is first look into what kind of stuff you're interested in. So I'd say like some things, right? So interests, right? So this is really about how you're choosing your program is based on what you're interested in or what you might be interested in. Maybe you don't know, yet, but you want to get a graduate degree. By the time you finish your bachelor's degree, you should know, what you're interested in if you want to do a graduate degree, or you should at least know that, narrow it down to some fields or areas. Reason being is that lots of institutions are really, really good in one spot, but just awful in another, right? I showed you guys this website before, CS rankings, right? Where, you have like all these different fields. So an example would be maybe like in let's see, like databases, for example, and a lot of other fields, MIT is, at the very top with a lot of faculty that are really good in it, right? Whereas if we go to maybe cryptography, then they're further down the list here, like still good, but further down the list. And you would probably want to consider going to one of the UCs because they're going to have more notable faculty in there, right? Who would be, better for doing research in cryptography, right? So it's a good idea to know, beforehand, maybe what you're interested in before going to these places so that you can, have the idea of working with a specific faculty member or with a set of faculty or whatever else, right? And so I'd say that's very important to figure out first. The second I'd say is the application of what you want to do. So we'll say application afterwards. So this is really, say that you want to do a master's or a PhD, like what are you wanting to do with it? Is this something where you want to go into industry after your master's? Do you want to get an MS PhD and then do research? Do you want to do a PhD and then go to industry? Do you want to be a professor? Do you want to be a lecturer? Like you got to figure out, what you're interested in. So I'd say that this is important to know before you start a program, not because it's super helpful in selecting where to go, though it can be a factor in that, but because you should have a good reason for wanting to do a graduate degree, because it's a big use of your time, right? These are the years where you have a lot of time that's spent after your bachelor's degree, solidifying yourself and sort of building the person that you are. And so with that time spent in graduate school, right, that's sort of where your time is going compared to, say, if you're being an engineer, then your time would be spent solidifying yourself in industry. And say that if your degree didn't work out because you hadn't thought it through beforehand and you drop out after 3 years, then, what do you have to show for those 3 years, right? Whereas like maybe peers that, decided to commit to a PhD program or decided to commit to engineering, they knew a lot better, what they wanted to do when they finished their bachelor's degree. Well, they're going to be further along in whatever career they are at, right? And so you want to make sure that you consider what do you, why are you doing this? Where are you going to use the skills that you're learning? The third thing to consider is requirements. So this really tells you like where, what kind of pool can you really consider to have for grad schools that you want to go to. Typically research requirements are going to be more, lesser for starting MS PhDs or master's or PhD programs than would just industry focused master's degrees, for example, because there's a lot less competition. So an example would be is if you want to do your bachelor's in computer science and then get a master's in say quantitative finance, right? That's going to be very, very competitive, right? Especially for like a higher end program, like that's going to be like the top 0.01% of applicants or something, right? Likewise, if you're wanting to go to say MIT or Carnegie Mellon or something like that to do your PhD, again, that's also very competitive. So consider, the requirements of these programs. And so that's also, with respect to that, is grades and test scores. Right. So there's like a lot of factors that go into your application when you're, considering doing grad school. I'll just go ahead and list some others. So it'd be like grades, your test scores, it'd be your recommendations, and these are usually the most important. An example is if you've been working during your bachelor's degree, say that you worked with someone who, got their PhD at MIT and knows the faculty there and did research with them there and left amicably, then that's going to be a very good recommendation if you want to go there, right? Because they know people there and they can vouch for you, right? Additionally, it's going to be your previous research. So whatever you did during your undergrad, also previous industry experience, right? And any sort of internships, that kind of stuff, right? And I'd also say like projects, right? What kind of projects that you do in your spare time. So, those I'd say that are sort of the main areas, right? In this test score, so there's actually a exam that's specific to grad schools in the US, and that's called the GRE, right? And this is, it's basically like a SAT type thing, but it's for grad school. I thought the GRE was much better than, the SAT and ACT when I had done those. The GRE is a lot less intensive, and typically you spend, only like 2 to 3 months working up to it. Whereas if you're doing the SAT or ACT, I know people who were doing like multiple years of prep for that, right? With the GRE, there's 3 areas. At least I believe there are 3 areas of testing. So it's out of the score of 170, and for each of those areas, and it's basically you have math, you have I think it's verbal reading, and then you have a writing portion. And the writing portion is scale like 0 to 6 or something like that. But basically you have, I think it's quantitative reasoning, verbal reasoning, and then writing, right? Analytical writing. The thing that's interesting about the GRE as a side note is it's actually a difficulty scaled exam. So the 170 doesn't mean you're in like the top, 0.1% or whatever. That really means you're in like the top 0.01%, because it actually is exponential in difficulty. You take the exam on a computer, and it will give you more difficult questions as you get, harder questions right. So a score of like 170 isn't, a score of like say 160 out of 170 isn't, linearly comparable to a score of 140 out of 170, which I thought, is pretty interesting. But yeah, I wouldn't worry much about the GRE. The GRE typically, in terms of at least research, so it's not really the same for industry stuff, but for research, applications, it's considered as more of like, you go to amusement park and there's like you must be, whatever whatever tall height to ride. It's kind of like that for a GRE, right? Where they just have a cutoff. They say, well, if you got whatever score out of 170 or higher on this whatever, then you're fine. We don't really care if you got the highest or if you're at the lower end of that range. We just want you to be good enough to meet that cutoff, and beyond that, we don't really care. And that's typically the attitude towards the GRE in the States for research. If you're doing, master's for industry or some more specific program, then I'd be a little bit more, focused on trying to make sure you get good scores out of that. But yeah, I'd still say that recommendations, and then depending on if you're doing industry or research for your master's degree focus, then you'd have like research or experience, right? Those would be your 3 most important areas. So the question asks, for projects, where would you recommend to get started? Yeah, so for projects, this is really going to be your own, whatever project you decide to do. They can be individual, they can be, groups of people working on stuff. So I'd say start with what you're interested in, right? Think about stuff that might be cool to have. So things that, maybe you want to start with something low resource, right? If you don't have like the budgeting to start, getting some hardware to work on some things, or maybe you're into like robots, but robotic components are expensive. Then, think about software that's, interesting that you might want to have, maybe an example, right, of something that came out of a project that's, pretty popular is improving a programming language, right? Or writing a library for a language, or writing a Minecraft mod, or maybe you're tired of different applications on your Windows operating system having different audio outputs, and you want like a program to switch those audio outputs, right? Maybe you want to improve quality of video calls, like Zoom is really crap, and so you set up your own solution for that. It's really, there's lots of stuff, right? It's sort of endless opportunities for what you find interesting, and a lot of it's just based on, well, I wish I had blank, right? Like I wish I had something that could do blank. And the good thing about CS is that you can, figure out how to make those things. And, if other people also wish they had blank and then you make blank, then that's a really good way for them to find, and use your project. And the more people that find and use it, then, it can expand. An example for me, right, is that when, I don't know if anyone, you probably remember when Pokemon Go first came out on the phones, and there were a lot of complaints about, wanting to camp out at specific spots looking for Pokemon. I think I was either in late high school or early bachelor's degree at that time. And I didn't, I wanted to figure out, where I could go to get specific Pokemon capture, whatever. And so I actually was one of the people who started working on those maps that I don't know if they have them anymore, but at the time, after the game was released a month or so after, all these maps started popping up online, where you could like go and find out where different Pokemon would be at different times of day. And you could, go to that spot and then collect them, right? And I was one of the people who was working on one of like the early versions of those maps that got pretty popular. And I was collaborating with like 20 different people, and that's because we just found it interesting, and we had this problem we wanted to solve, and other people thought they wanted to solve it as well, and so it got pretty big, and you had tens of thousands of people using it. So it's stuff like that that you just find an opportunity, and you work on it that way. As per maybe like something that you can start more methodically to work on, there's lots of ways to fine tune your skills for developing projects. And that would be, looking at what kinds of requirements projects may have as per languages that you would work on, or frameworks that you would use. If you're interested in being like a web developer, maybe you'd want to learn about Node.js, or maybe you'd want to learn about Angular or other web frameworks, right? And so in those cases, you can start with just learning those things, and then maybe a project will come to you, right? But, in order to make a project, you kind of have to have that baseline information and know how to do things and be able to figure it out. And so, even if you don't have a project idea yet, work on learning those things, and then one will come to you. Okay, so I think that's pretty much what I have. I want to reiterate that. I guess so for the application process, one more thing to clarify for the application process for MS and PhD programs, this is going to vary by institution, but typically it'll be that it's similar in how you did your bachelor's applications, that you would have applications you send in with your resume, whatever work you did, your transcripts, all that stuff, right? And all the stuff listed here. And then what you would do for a PhD program, they usually do visits. So this is where, you would be able to go and visit the university for, a few days at some point. And they would, give you a tour and try to convince you that their program is good and stuff like that, right? Because basically PhD students are very cheap labor for research institutions. Like you can get to the point where you're doing really good research, but they have to pay you, like only $30,000 a year or something like that, compared to, higher end research at 120,000 or something, right? So it's cheap, and they want to convince you that their program is the best for you to be at. So they'll also do like that kind of experience as well. But yeah, it'll depend on the program that you want to be in, as per what other requirements they have. Maybe they want you to write an essay. Maybe they want you to, get in contact with the professor before you get there. It really depends, but that's important why you look into places first where you might want to apply to, and then you can do those applications and figure out what the requirements are. So if anyone's had any questions, about more things about research or grad school interested or whatever, and doing a master's degree or something like that, then feel free to ask me, let me know. And otherwise, I will see you all next week. Don't forget to turn in the assignment on Moodle and go vote if you have not voted.